Some homes offer hospitality, others offer commandments. Tonight, we're opening the door to 101 house rules so strangely specific you'll start questioning reality and your manners. Keep your voice steady, your face neutral, and your survival instincts ready. The tour is short, the rules are long, and yes, judgment is absolutely included. One person had a host with a strict no humming policy. Not just humming, but also no whistling or quiet singing. The reason? It apparently disrupted the vibrational harmony of the home. So your happiness is literally a structural risk to their feng shui. Better just sit there and blink quietly. 2. A guest was told they were only allowed to use a maximum of 3 squares of toilet paper per visit. 3. For any situation. If you needed more, you were supposed to wait and try again later. It's less of a house rule and more of a psychological experiment in desperation and poor hygiene. 3. You were required to make direct eye contact with the family cat every time you entered a room and say, "I acknowledge your presence, Supreme Overlord." The host was dead serious, claiming it prevented the cat from placing a curse on guests. Guess I'll take my chances with the curse, thanks. 4. At another house, the couch cushions were for decorative purposes only. Guests were explicitly instructed not to sit in a way that would dent, depress, or otherwise displace the cushions. You basically had to levitate over the sofa. It was less of a living room and more of a museum showroom. 5. A host insisted that all conversations be held at a specific volume, which he called Level 2. If you spoke any louder, he'd shush you like a disturbed librarian. If you were too quiet, he'd ask you to speak up. It was the most stressful, least relaxing party of all time. 6. Using a drink coaster was a 2-step process. You had to pick up the coaster, place your drink down, and then place the coaster on top of the drink. This was to prevent airborne dust particles from contaminating the beverage. I think the host's brain was already contaminated with something else. 7. One family had a rule that you could not, under any circumstances, realign the fridge magnets. They were arranged in a specific, historically accurate diorama of the Battle of Gettysburg. Moving a single magnet was considered an act of disrespect to the Union soldiers. And, to the magnets. 8. A friend's parents had a no bad news rule in their home. You weren't allowed to discuss anything negative from the outside world. Lost your job? Car broke down? Not in this house. This wasn't a home, it was a delusional bubble of forced positivity. How exhausting. 9. It was mandatory to compliment the host's cooking after every third bite. Not just at the end of the meal, but during the actual process of eating. It turned dinner into a weird, robotic performance of constant praise. Delicious. Choo-choo. Still delicious. Swallow. Wow. Just fantastic. 10. Guests had to leave their shoes outside in a designated shoe quarantine box for at least 1 hour before they could be brought into the garage. Not the house, the garage. The host believed this was necessary to de-energize them from the stresses of the outside world. Sounds perfectly rational. 11. If you needed to flush the toilet between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., you had to go downstairs and do it in the basement. The host claimed the sound of the upstairs toilet flushing would wake up his wife. Apparently, the sound of you clomping down 2 flights of stairs in the dark was somehow much quieter. 12. A friend's parents forbade anyone from making microwave popcorn. Ever. They claimed the smell from a single bag 10 years prior had permanently infused the drywall and they couldn't risk it again. They spoke about it with the seriousness of a nuclear fallout event. It was the popcorn Chernobyl of 2014. 13. To get the Wi-Fi password, you had to correctly answer a trivia question about the host. If you got it wrong, you had to wait an hour before you could try again with a new question. It felt less like a friendly visit and more like a low-budget game show, where the prize was basic internet access. 14. In one house, the books on the shelves were purely for aesthetics. You were allowed to look at them, but you couldn't open any book more than a 45-degree angle to avoid cracking the spine. The punchline? They were all cheap paperbacks from the grocery store, truly priceless literary artifacts. 15. Guests were given assigned seats in the living room for the duration of their stay. You couldn't just sit wherever you wanted. This was to maintain the room's established energy flow. So you could get stuck in the stiff, uncomfortable chair in the corner for an entire weekend. Fun. 16. Showers were strictly timed to 2 minutes. The host would literally stand outside the bathroom door with a stopwatch and would give a 30-second warning knock. It was like being in a military boot camp, but with worse water pressure and a much creepier drill sergeant. 17. This host had a rigid system for utensil usage. A specific fork was for salad, another for the main course, and a third for dessert. If you used the dinner fork to steal a bite of salad, the host would visibly flinch and lecture you on culinary discipline. Meals were basically a final exam. 18. All interior doors, including the bedroom door, had to be left open at all times. Not wide open, but specifically cracked 3 inches. The reason? To allow the spirits of the house to move freely. It also allowed the host to hear every word you said. Very spiritual. Very little privacy. 19. The television volume could only be set to a prime number, 11, 13, 17, 19, and so on. The host insisted it produced a mathematically purer sound wave, so you either couldn't hear the movie at all or it was blasting your eardrums out. There was no comfortable in between. 20. In the guest room, you weren't allowed to sleep under the covers. You had to sleep on top of the perfectly made bed using a separate single thin sheet they provided. This was to keep the main bedding pristine. It was like being a human doily, carefully placed for decoration. 21. When leaving the house, it was mandatory to face the front door and say, "Thank you, house, for your shelter." If you forgot, the host would get genuinely offended on the house's behalf. You had to respect the building's feelings, which were apparently very, very sensitive. 22. Absolutely no outside food or drink was allowed inside. Not because they were great hosts with a full fridge, but because foreign items had unvetted auras that could energetically contaminate their pantry. Your bag of chips was basically a spiritual biohazard. 23. One family had carpet runners all over their beautiful hardwood floors, and you were forbidden from stepping off them. The host treated the actual floor as if it were molten lava. You had to navigate the entire house by hopping from one tiny rug to another. 24. Guests were strictly forbidden from looking at, touching, or even breathing in the direction of the thermostat. The host had a theory that the presence of human body heat nearby would confuse the sensors and throw off the entire HVAC system. The temperature was not up for discussion. 25. A host required all guests to walk on their tiptoes after 10 p.m. Not just be quiet, but literally tiptoe everywhere. The reason wasn't to avoid waking people up, but to not disturb the floorboard's slumber. The dog, however, was allowed to run around and bark its head off. 26. A host provided a single, small hand towel for a guest's entire weekend stay. This one towel was meant to be used for hands, face, and for drying off after a shower. When the guest asked for a fresh one, the host simply said, "Don't worry, it's a special antimicrobial fabric." Apparently, that magic fabric can also defy the laws of physics and moisture. 27. At one house, absolutely nothing could be placed in the kitchen sink. Not a cup, not a spoon, nothing. You had to wash, dry, and put away each item immediately after using it. The host called the empty sink a symbol of a clear and uncluttered mind. Meanwhile, my mind was just cluttered with thoughts of how completely insane this was. 28. One guest was instructed they had to walk backwards when leaving any room. The host, an amateur historian, claimed it was an ancient tradition to show respect and prove you weren't plotting an attack as you departed. It turned a simple trip to the bathroom into a clumsy, neck-straining, and hazardous retreat. 29. In this home, you were not permitted to use any overhead lights. Only lamps. The host was convinced that the direct light from a ceiling fixture aggressively pushes down on your spirit and causes anxiety. So you spent the entire visit stumbling around in a dimly lit, spiritually safe obstacle course. 30. A host had a strict, no looking out the front living room window rule. He wasn't worried about privacy. He was in a bitter, decade-long feud with his neighbor. He claimed that any eye contact, even accidental from his property, would Give the enemy the satisfaction. You were basically an unwilling soldier in his petty suburban war. 31. All communication with the family dog, a massive 120-pound Rottweiler, had to be done in a high-pitched baby talk voice. You couldn't just say, "Here, boy." It had to be, "Who's a whittle sweetie pie? Does baby want a tweet?" Hearing a grown man use that voice to call a guard dog is a core memory you can't delete. 32. Guests were forbidden from leaving their clothes on a chair or the floor. Everything, including the clothes you were about to wear, had to be kept inside your zipped suitcase at all times. The host's reasoning was to prevent shedding personal energy signatures onto the furniture. Your suitcase was a Faraday cage for your soul. 33. If you wanted a glass of water, you were not allowed to get it yourself. You had to ask the host, who would then personally vet the glass for cleanliness and pour the water from a specific pitcher that was always aligned with the Earth's magnetic north. It was the most bureaucratic glass of water ever served. 34. Every time you walked past a particularly ugly ceramic vase in the hallway, you were expected to say something nice about it. The host's grandmother had made it, and the family believed the vase thrived on positive affirmations. So multiple times a day you'd find yourself muttering, "Looking good today, vase." 35. This host required everyone at the dinner table to hold their fork and knife in the formal European style, even when eating pizza or a hamburger. He would actually stop the meal to give unsolicited lessons on proper grip and posture. It was less of a friendly cookout and more of a tense, uncomfortable etiquette class. 36. You had to park your car so that the front tires were perfectly centered on a specific, tiny crack in the driveway. The host would come outside with a measuring tape to verify your alignment. This wasn't about neatness. He just knew it would perfectly annoy the neighbor who had to look at it all day. It was weaponized parking. 37. The household trash system involved 5 different bins in the kitchen, and you had to pass a verbal quiz on what went where before you were allowed to throw anything away. Getting it wrong meant a condescending lecture on the subtle nuances of recyclable plastics. It was easier just to keep your garbage in your pockets. 38. Making the guest bed in the morning was mandatory, but it had to be done with military precision, including perfect 45-degree hospital corners on the sheets. The host would inspect it, and if it wasn't perfect, she would sigh dramatically and remake it right in front of you. A true masterclass in the art of passive aggression. 39. The word stuff was completely banned in one house. You couldn't say, "I'll go get my stuff," or "What's this stuff?" The host, a failed poet, claimed the word was intellectually lazy and a crime against the English language. You had to find a dozen different synonyms just to function normally. 40. At this home, you were not allowed to look in any mirror for more than 5 consecutive seconds. The host had a bizarre theory that prolonged gazing could invite your doppelganger from an alternate dimension into their home. Apparently, their interdimensional security system was just that weak. 41. A guest was told that if they were the last person to leave a room, they had to turn the light switch off with their left elbow. Not their hand, not their right elbow, only the left one. The host explained this minimized the transfer of skin oils and preserved the sanctity of the light switch. You know, that sacred plastic rectangle on the wall. 42. This host's family had a rule that you couldn't eat any round-shaped food. No peas, no meatballs, no M&Ms. They believed that spherical foods rolled through your digestive system too quickly, preventing proper nutrient absorption. So, all your food had to have sharp, inefficient corners. It's just simple, completely unhinged science. 43. In one house, it was forbidden to tell a joke that you had already heard from someone else. All humor had to be 100% original, created on the spot. The host considered joke-telling to be a form of plagiarism. It was the least funny, most high-pressure social gathering of all time. 44. A family friend required guests to wear special house-provided Crocs at all times. But the catch was, you had to put them on over your existing socks or shoes. You'd be clomping around with your sneakers stuffed into a pair of giant, squeaky plastic clogs. It was a fashion statement that screamed, "I've completely given up on life." 45. Before entering the pool, guests had to dunk their heads into a bucket of ice water for 10 seconds. The host, a former competitive swimmer, claimed this was to properly acclimate the cranium to the temperature change. It felt less like a safety measure and more like a fraternity hazing ritual. 46. This host insisted that all plants in the house be addressed by their proper Latin names. If you accidentally called the snake plant a snake plant, he would condescendingly correct you. You mean the Dracaena trifasciata, of course. It's hard to feel at home when you need a botany degree just to talk about the decor. 47. You were not allowed to sit on the same piece of furniture for more than 1 hour at a time. After 60 minutes, you had to get up and move to a different chair or a different spot on the couch. This was to prevent uneven wear on the upholstery. The house had more of a seating chart than a wedding reception. 48. A host had a rule that no one could use contractions in their speech. You couldn't say don't, can't, or it's. You had to speak the full do not, cannot, and it is. He claimed it promoted clearer thinking and more articulate conversation. In reality, it just made everyone sound like a malfunctioning robot. 49. At one dinner party, guests were given a list of 3 approved topics for conversation. They were 19th century architecture, the migratory patterns of geese, and the host's recent trip to Ohio. Any deviation from these topics would be met with an awkward silence and a swift change of subject back to geese. 50. In this house, you had to hum a specific 2-note melody every time you opened the refrigerator. The host said it was a sonic password that let the fridge know you were a friend, not a foe. You had to do this even if you were just grabbing a bottle of water. I'm pretty sure the fridge didn't care either way. 51. The toilet lid had to be down at all times, even when the toilet was in use. You had to lift it, do your business, and immediately close it before you flushed. The host had an irrational fear of toilet plume, believing a single flush with an open lid could launch germs into low Earth orbit. 52. Guests were forbidden from taking pictures inside the house. Not for privacy reasons, but because the host believed that camera flashes steal tiny fragments of a home's soul. So no memories of your visit, and the house gets to keep its soul fully intact. Seems like a fair trade. 53. If you borrowed a pen, you were required to return it to the exact same spot, oriented in the exact same direction you found it. The host had a photograph of the desk setup for reference. This wasn't about organization, it was about maintaining a perfectly static, joyless environment. 54. At a friend's house, any liquid spilled, even a single drop of water, was treated as a major catastrophe. The host would sprint to the scene with a full hazmat-style cleanup kit, cordoning off the area and intensely scrubbing the spot for 10 minutes. You learned to be very, very careful with your drinks. 55. There was a strict no singing in the shower rule. However, you were encouraged to recite poetry instead. The host felt that singing was too emotionally chaotic for the bathroom's acoustics, while poetry offered a more structurally sound auditory experience. I'll stick to being emotionally chaotic, thanks. 56. The TV remote was strictly off-limits to guests. The host referred to himself as the curator of the audio-visual experience and required you to submit a verbal request to change the channel. He would then consider your request, weigh its merits against his viewing schedule, and deliver a verdict. It was less relaxing than a C-SPAN marathon. 57. A host demanded that every bite of food be chewed exactly 32 times before swallowing. He claimed this was the scientifically optimal number for digestion and would actually watch you count. Dinner felt less like a meal and more like a high-stakes, synchronized chewing competition that you could definitely lose. 58. After showering, you were required to squeegee every single surface. Not just the glass door, but all tiled walls, the faucet, the shower head, and the floor. He provided a detailed diagram. It was a full 15-minute post-shower workout. You left the bathroom cleaner than when you entered, and also more exhausted. 59. Pointing was absolutely forbidden. You couldn't point at something you wanted. You couldn't point to give directions. Nothing. The host believed that pointing your finger created a focused stream of aggressive energy that could puncture the room's aura. You had to vaguely gesture with an open palm like you were presenting a game show prize. 60. After finishing your meal, you had to arrange your knife and fork on the plate to indicate your level of satisfaction. Pointing at 6 o'clock meant it was excellent, 3 o'clock was average, and 9 o'clock was a grave insult. Every meal ended with this weird, passive-aggressive cutlery-based performance review. 61. Any form of sighing was banned from the house. The host considered it a flagrant display of negativity and an audible pollutant. If you let one slip, he would stop everything and ask you to please process your discontent silently. It was the most emotionally constipated environment imaginable. 62. You had to take your shoes off at the door, but the rule didn't stop there. You had to place them in a designated closet with the toes pointing towards the back wall. The host explained that this allowed the shoes to rest peacefully after their journey and face away from the temptations of the outside world. 63. Every morning, before you could speak to any person, you were required to greet the ancient grandfather clock in the hallway. You had to look it in the face and say, "Good morning, Winston." The host insisted Winston got terribly morose if he was ignored. I'm pretty sure Winston didn't care, but the host definitely did. 64. The living room had a patterned carpet, and you were only allowed to step on the beige-colored diamonds. Touching the blue parts was a major faux pas. Navigating from the couch to the kitchen was a ridiculous game of Twister that no one wanted to play. The floor was literally lava, but only parts of it. 65. Laughter was only permitted if the host initiated it. If a guest told a joke, you had to wait for the host's reaction before you were allowed to laugh. It created this bizarre, awkward delay where everyone would just stare at him, waiting for permission to find something funny. Humor has never been so stressful. 66. The window blinds in the guest room had to remain angled at a perfect 45-degree angle at all times. Not fully open, not fully closed. The host would come in to correct them if he noticed they were off. He called it the optimal configuration for light diffusion and psychic security. Of course he did. 67. Before leaving the dinner table, each guest had to fold their used cloth napkin into the shape of a swan. The host would provide a quick, condescending lesson if you didn't know how. Nothing says fine dining like struggling to create a greasy, food-stained piece of origami while everyone watches you fail. 68. You were forbidden from letting your bare feet touch the tiled floors in the kitchen or bathroom. The host believed the sudden cold was a violent shock to the nervous system. He provided communal tile-crossing slippers at the edge of the carpet, which somehow seemed far more unsanitary than just walking on the floor. 69. By the front door, there was a guest logbook. You were required to sign in and out every time you left or entered the house, noting the time and the purpose of your excursion. It felt less like visiting a friend and more like being an inmate on a very lenient work release program. 70. The host had a daily ice cube quota. Each guest was allocated a small personal ice tray with exactly 4 cubes in it. Once you used your 4 cubes for the day, that was it. You had to embrace the lukewarm lifestyle. It was a bizarre power move that established who was truly in control of the freezer. 71. This host had a strict no brand names on clothing rule. If you were wearing a shirt with a visible logo, you were asked to either turn it inside out or cover the logo with a piece of tape. The host claimed it was to prevent the home from being tainted by corporate consumerism. It was like living in a socialist commune run by your weird uncle. 72. The toilet paper had to be dispensed in the over position, not under. If a guest changed it to the under position, the host would call a full-on house meeting to discuss the transgression. He would explain with diagrams why the over method was superior for both hygiene and aesthetics. It was a TED Talk nobody asked for. 73. A family had a rule that you could only tell stories that had a happy ending. If you started to recount a negative or even a neutral experience, the host would cut you off and say, "Let's skip to the good part." It turned every conversation into a heavily censored, ridiculously optimistic version of reality. 74. The guest room came with a pre-approved reading list. You were only allowed to bring books from their curated collection into the bedroom. The host explained that certain genres, like thrillers or horror, contained negative literary vibrations that could contaminate the sleeping space. So much for reading what you actually enjoy. 75. At one house, every time the phone rang, you had to stop what you were doing and stand perfectly still and silent until the call was over. It was a sign of respect for the conversation. This applied even if you were just in the same room. It was like a house-wide game of freeze tag, but the only person having fun was the host. 76. After using the microwave, you were required to leave the door open for exactly 5 minutes to allow the agitated molecules to settle. The host believed that closing the door immediately would trap chaotic microwave energy inside. The result was a kitchen where the microwave door was almost always hanging wide open. 77. This host had a bizarre obsession with symmetry. If you took one cookie from the cookie jar, you were required to take a second one from the opposite side to maintain the visual balance. This rule applied to everything from decorative pillows to the arrangement of food on your plate. It was a nightmare for anyone who just wanted one cookie. 78. Guests were forbidden from using the front door. Everyone, regardless of the occasion, had to enter and exit through the back door that led through the muddy yard and the cluttered garage. The host wanted to keep the entryway ceremonially pure. It made every arrival and departure feel like a sneaky, undignified escape. 79. You couldn't just throw your tissues in the trash. Used tissues had to be placed in a separate, sealed biohazard bag to contain the germs. The host would then dispose of this bag with the kind of theatrical caution you'd expect from someone handling enriched uranium. Having a simple cold felt like a level 4 quarantine event. 80. The butter dish had a strict rule. You could only take butter from the right side. The left side was reserved exclusively for the host. He claimed he could taste the energy of other people's knife strokes, and it ruined his toast. So half the butter was his, and half was for the rest of humanity. 81. This family required you to describe your dreams every morning at the breakfast table. It wasn't optional. You had to share every detail, and they would proceed to collectively analyze what your subconscious was trying to tell you. It was a mandatory group therapy session before you'd even had your first cup of coffee. 82. All phone charging had to be done in a single, designated charging station in the hallway. You were not allowed to plug your phone in anywhere else, especially not the bedroom. The host had a theory that charging phones near where you sleep scrambles your brain's electrical field. Sounds legit. 83. When speaking to the host's elderly, half-deaf grandmother, you weren't allowed to raise your voice. Instead, you had to speak at a normal volume directly into a vintage, non-functional microphone that he would hand to you. He insisted it focused the sonic vibrations, even though it wasn't plugged into anything. 84. You were not allowed to walk around the house with wet hair. After a shower, you had to remain in the bathroom until your hair was at least 80% dry, either by towel drying or using a hairdryer. The host had an irrational fear of stray water droplets, destabilizing the structural integrity of the drywall. 85. A host had a rule that all compliments had to be delivered as a 3-part statement. You couldn't just say, "This food is delicious." You had to say, "The visual presentation is excellent, the aroma is delightful, and the taste is superb." It turned every nice gesture into a formal, structured, and completely awkward declaration. 86. At this house, you were strictly forbidden from closing any kitchen cabinet doors. The host had to be the one to do it. She claimed she could feel if they were closed improperly, which would upset the kinetic flow of the kitchen. So you just had to leave everything hanging wide open like a poltergeist just raided the pantry. 87. One host had a complete ban on rhetorical questions. If you asked something like, "Who wouldn't want another slice of pizza?" he would stare at you blankly and demand a genuine answer. He believed these types of questions created unresolved conversational loops in the universe. It was exhausting. 88. If you happened to be in the laundry room when the host's delicates were in the dryer, you were required to avert your eyes. You could not, under any circumstances, look at her underwear. It was the most awkward, silent, and visually restrictive laundry experience you could possibly imagine. 89. You were not allowed to put ice in your water. The host, an avid water connoisseur, insisted that the rapid temperature change from ice bruises the delicate H2O molecules, thus ruining the drinking experience. You were expected to enjoy your room temperature, unbruised water, and like it. 90. There was a strict no finger snapping policy. The host's poodle, Barnaby, had a traumatic puppyhood experience and now associated the sound with an impending apocalypse. A single snap would send the dog into a howling frenzy, and you would be blamed for triggering its existential dread. 91. All guests had to back their cars into the driveway. No exceptions. The host was a doomsday prepper who believed everyone needed to be ready for a rapid, forward-facing evacuation at a moment's notice. The biggest emergency we faced all weekend was running out of chips. 92. When you finished reading a magazine, you had to place it back on the coffee table, with the cover perfectly aligned with the table's edge, facing north. The host used a compass app on his phone to verify the alignment. It was less of a living room and more of a tightly regulated library for neurotic people. 93. A host required all guests to take a scent-neutralizing shower upon arrival, using his special, unscented soap. He had curated the house's ambient aroma and claimed any foreign scents from a guest's personal products were olfactory aggressors. You had to wash off your own personality upon entry. 94. You absolutely had to finish every single scrap of food on your plate. Not for the usual don't waste food reasons, but because the host believed that uneaten food on a plate emits audible sighs of sorrow that only she could hear. You were eating to prevent a paranormal auditory event. 95. In one highly intellectual household, the word obvious was forbidden. The host, a philosophy professor, argued that nothing in the universe was truly obvious, and using the word was a sign of a lazy mind. You had to find incredibly convoluted ways to say that the sky was blue. 96. Guests were instructed that when using the bathroom, they were not to use the good hand towels hanging by the sink. Instead, they had to use a specific roll of paper towels located in the closet down the hall. The decorative towels were apparently just for show and not for human hands. 97. This host required you to wear a small bell on your wrist, like a cat, for the duration of your stay. He was a very light sleeper and easily startled. The bell was meant to announce your presence as you moved through the house so he would never be surprised. It made you feel like a fool and a farm animal simultaneously. 98. There was a rule against placing your drinking glass directly on any surface. Not just wood, any surface. You had to hold your drink at all times unless it was in the sink. The host believed coasters were a crutch for the careless, and that constant vigilance was the only real solution. 99. The family dog, a Chihuahua named General Patton, had to be saluted every time you entered the living room. It wasn't a joke. You had to give a full military-style salute and say, "General, sir." The dog would just stare at you, but the host would nod with grave approval. 100. You were not allowed to bring your phone into the bathroom. The host had a theory that the steam from the shower could infiltrate the phone's motherboard and steal your data. He wasn't worried about you dropping it. He was worried about a ghost in the machine literally hacking you via water vapor. 101. Upon arrival, a guest was handed a beautifully laminated multi-page guest constitution. It outlined every rule in the house, complete with a preamble and several amendments. The final page was a short quiz on the rules, and you had to score at least 80% to be allowed to stay the night. Your turn. What's the pettiest rule you secretly enforce at home, or the one here you'd break first on principle? Name it in the comments and defend it. If you snorted at least once, like this video. If you recognized your family, subscribe before someone hands you a laminated guest constitution.